This is a WMUR Commitment 2018 special in partnership with St. Anselm College and the New Hampshire Union Leader, the Granite State Debates.
A U.S. Navy veteran, Republican candidate Eddie Edwards made a career in law enforcement, graduating from the National FBI Academy and serving as Chief of New Hampshire Liquor Enforcement and Chief of Police in Southampton. He's worked in business and politics with an eye toward cutting through the red tape, reflecting his ideology as a conservative who believes in lower taxes, less government, and fewer regulations.
I want families in charge of their communities. I want families to be in charge of government, not the other way around.
Edwards, who is married and has 2 daughters, is also known from his competitive powerlifting days when he set a New Hampshire state record for his weight class, deadlifting 725 pounds. It's a strength he thinks would benefit him in Washington.
I think it would be great, get down to Congress and show people how to focus, how to get things done, and how to overcome challenges. That's what it's all about.
His Democratic opponent is Chris Pappas, a Manchester native who graduated from Central High, then Harvard. Pappas is now co-owner of the iconic Puritan Backroom in Manchester and says he wants to champion other New Hampshire businesses facing many of the same challenges he says he does running his restaurant.
Well, we believe in investing in our employees, and, we've been in business for 101 years.
Pappas has done more than make the ice cream for the Puritan. He was elected as a state representative in 2002, served 2 terms, and then was elected to 2 terms as the Hillsborough County Treasurer. He has been an executive counselor representing District 4 since 2013. He's an active member of several nonprofit boards and keeps in shape by running a few miles every day.
This is about making sure that the people of New Hampshire are well represented in Congress. And I'm also excited to be a part of a new generation of people that are running for the House this year.
The 2 candidates hoping to bring New Hampshire's traditions to Capitol Hill.
Tonight, the candidates for the 1st Congressional District.
Good evening and welcome to the 2018 Granite State Debates. I'm WMUR Political Director Adam Sexton, and we're live at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics on the campus of St. Anselm College. We begin our series this week with the candidates in the 1st Congressional District. They're running to represent nearly all of eastern New Hampshire, from the seacoast through Carroll County. District 1 also reaches west into the Lakes region and encompasses Manchester, New Hampshire's largest city. Questions tonight will come from myself and our panelists. Candidates will get 1 minute to answer each question. 30-second rebuttals will be allowed at the moderator's discretion. And let's meet our panel of distinguished journalists tonight. They are Lauren Chooljian of New Hampshire Public Radio, John DeStaso of WMUR, and Kevin Landrigan of the New Hampshire Union Leader. And without further ado, let's get to our first question, and it comes from John DeStaso.
Thank you, Adam. Good evening to both of you. We are coming off of a weekend where there was yet another mass shooting in this country. This one, of course, at a synagogue in Pittsburgh. So this question is about the gun issue in light of that. So for Mr. Edwards, many people are quick to say that guns are not the issue when it comes to these types of tragic events. At this point, though, why not try an approach where restrictions on firearms are imposed? Is there any one restriction, for instance, that you can point to that is not already in place that you would propose?
Well, John, thank you for the question. I greatly appreciate it. Let me start off by saying that the tragic events that have unfolded are staying on our country. People should never be targeted because of their race, their ethnicity, their gender. And what we've seen a couple of incidents like this in the past. We saw synagogue shootings. We saw 2 African Americans, one shot in the back of the head, trying to walk into a store. Those are horrifying. But when it comes to government, restraining government, the Bill of Rights, I'm a big proponent of the 10th Amendment as well, because I think in New Hampshire we have reasonable gun laws. And our state's done a very good job because we have a culture here that respects human decency. I'm not interested in going to Washington, D.C. to have the federal government interfere in New Hampshire's business. And so I think the state's done a good job of working with our communities, our family and law enforcement community to address these issues. This is not a role for the federal government.
Thank you. And Mr. Pappas, how far are you willing to go with additional laws that limit firearm sales?
Well, thank you to Adam, to the panel, and to Mr. Edwards for being here tonight. We all have heavy hearts in seeing the situation that unfolded in Pittsburgh, which is all too common in this country. We're facing a uniquely American tragedy where we lost 32,000 individuals in this nation to gun violence last year. And while it's important that we offer our thoughts and prayers, and that can help people heal and bring communities together, We need more than just that. We need public policies that are going to allow us to protect public safety and plug the gaps that exist in the background check system. This is a difference between myself and my opponent. He wants to repeal the federal background check system. I believe that we need to strengthen it and make sure that we truly have universal checks for all gun purchases. That can help weapons falling into the wrong hands and help prevent tragedies like this in the future. I believe that we can respect the culture of responsible gun ownership that exists here in New Hampshire, while at the same time taking important steps to try to keep people safe.
Mr. Edwards, you were invoked there. You can have 30 seconds.
Thank you. Chris knows that's not true. I'm not in favor of the government illegally retaining the names of individuals in this country. I get very concerned when the federal government starts illegally retaining the names of individuals. I'm happy to look at reforming background checks, but not in such a way that we constantly violate the law. As I've said often, we restrain government. That's what the Bill of Rights does, and we hold citizens accountable. The Second Amendment, Chris, has nothing to do with hunting and collection. It is a right that has been established, not one that the government provides.
Mr. Edwards, and Mr. Pappas, you can respond.
I would just say this, that you checked a box saying that you want to repeal the Brady Law and get rid of the instant check system at the federal level. I think that's a dangerous policy that's going to make us less safe. We should plug the holes that exist in the background check system and work to preserve the Second Amendment rights of people here in New Hampshire while keeping people safe.
Mr. Edwards, you can have 15 seconds to respond, then we'll get to the next question.
Sure. Again, Chris is misstating my position because he's not interested in truly protecting citizens. We have reasonable gun laws here, and when the federal government is illegally retaining the names, he has not made one reference to that fact.
Okay, staying on this issue with Mr. DeCeso.
Yes, sir. Mr. Pappas, you are in favor of red flag laws, you've said, which allow police and family members to seek help from a court to remove guns from dangerous situations. What specific mental health conditions should be included in those laws, and how far should law enforcement be allowed to go in order to gather mental health information?
I think it's important to have this conversation about what steps we can take to address the tragedy of gun violence in this country. You know, I've met so many young people who are really determined not to let this issue slip from the headlines as it has so many times in the past. And I think there are proposals out there that we can take a look at to try to make sure that law enforcement and family members can intervene at a time when it's really clear that someone's going to do harm to themselves or to others around them. We've seen this in instances of gun violence in our country in the recent past, including some of the school shootings. And I think we've got to focus on how we have a stronger community-based mental health system to ensure that individuals don't get to a crisis point. But we also have to make sure that law enforcement and family members can respond in a responsible manner. So I would look forward to those conversations about how we could craft something that respects the rights of individuals while at the same time keeps people safe.
But are there specific instances or conditions that you feel should be included in these laws? And is there anything specific that you could point to?
Well, I think it's important to leave this up to family members and law enforcement to figure out exactly what a situation looks like and what kind of danger is presented to the individual, him or herself, or to the greater community. So I would look to those local voices in terms of how we set something up that could keep people safe.
Question to Mr. Edwards now.
Yes, Mr. Edwards, the questionnaires that had been posted on your website prior to the September primary, then removed. In those questionnaires, you opposed all prohibitions on ammunition, all background checks. You opposed federal gun-free zones, and you opposed prohibitions on silencers and suppressors. I guess if we started from scratch, where are the areas that you would like to see restrictions?
Well, first let me say, I'm the only candidate on this stage that's had the awesome responsibility of issuing a firearms permit to another citizen. I took my responsibility very seriously as a law enforcement leader. And I take safety very seriously. As a 16-year-old, the first time I ever had a gun pointed in my face, I was 16 years old getting off a city bus. This is an issue that is very concerning to me. But more concerning is how we do things like this. How do we make sure that our citizens' rights are protected without government infringement? So we have to do that in a responsible way. And I think the red flag legislation you just heard Chris talk about, there is no way of removing someone from the list. His response to your question is, let's let law enforcement and the community decide. You're running to be a legislator and you want to bring the federal government into the state of New Hampshire. That conversation needs to be had long before we start passing laws to determine how people are going to be taken off a list. He's so concerned about compiling lists, but not the mechanism to remove someone from a list.
Mr. Pappas, you've been invoked. You can have 30 seconds.
Well, I clearly trust local law enforcement, and I'm proud to stand in this campaign with the New Hampshire Troopers Association, with the Manchester Police Patrolmen. I know they do a great job at keeping our state safe and getting it right. And I think that we can work in a collaborative manner to make sure that we have laws on the books at the state and federal level to protect people, while at the same time protecting individual rights. I don't think that's too much to ask. I don't think that's going too far. And I think my opponent has a dangerous position that would make us less safe.
Okay, we're going to move on to the next topic. The question comes from Lauren Schulchen.
Mr. Pappas, first to you. The country seems so divided right now, and in some circumstances, people are becoming violent. We just witnessed a man mailing bombs to prominent Democrats around the country. Why do you think our political atmosphere is the way it is right now?
Politics has become a zero-sum game, and unfortunately, it's all too divisive in Washington, D.C. You know, we've seen the rise of hate crimes, of anti-Semitism that led to the shooting in Pittsburgh recently. We've seen people lash out, and there's been a high level of political intolerance. We have got to rein this in and get back to basics as a country. It's important for our leaders, including the President of the United States, to set the right tone. And as someone who's worked at the state level, as a member of our executive council, our state's board of directors, I know how to work across the aisle. I've worked with governors of both parties, with people of diverse points of view on the issues that are important at the end of the day. I've served 260,000 constituents, and I listen to each and every one of them when they have a problem and need help. And I think that's what we have to get back to as a country, to look for ways to talk with each other, not past one another, to look to build relationships with people of diverse points of view, because that's going to open up the doors for us to be able to restore civility and decency and an ability to get some things done. I think we need some New Hampshire know-how in Washington, D.C., and that's what I would look to apply.
Mr. Edwards, now to you. Why is our political atmosphere so divisive right now?
Sure. I think we can look towards career politicians who brought us to this point. When I think about what's really going on in our country, we have a resistance movement in this country that adds to that chaos. We've seen Washington, D.C. Politicians influence my opponent, where he is resisting the will of the people in the CD1, the will of the people of this country. And I think that adds to this, encouraging people to confront other citizens in restaurants, taking highly emotional, passionate people and sending them into places and encouraging them to confront people who are also highly emotional and passionate. What could go wrong in those type of situations? And I think that's why you see this type of chaos in our country right now. Listen, this is about leadership. This is what this is really about, leadership. Understanding how to bring people together. I've done that my entire life in the United States Navy and in law enforcement. I know how to work with people from various backgrounds, but I don't believe in resisting. I believe in leadership.
Mr. Pappas, your response can be built into the next question, which follows on this issue.
Sure. Starting with Mr. Edwards, though, so what's one thing that you think Republicans could do to make the political atmosphere more conciliatory?
Well, sure. I think the first thing we could do is start having transparency and communication. Stop demonizing one another. So when someone disagrees with me, I don't think that's a time to call them names and label them things simply because they disagree. It's okay to disagree with a black person, not be called racist. It's okay to disagree with a gay person, not be called homophobic. I think it's okay to disagree with a woman, not be called a sexist. I think we have to get back to a place where we stop demonizing and thinking the very worst of our fellow citizens when we're all trying to get to the same place.
And Mr. Pappas, what's one thing the Democrats could do to make the atmosphere more conciliatory?
Well, this is about leadership, and it goes all the way to the top, to the President of the United States, and the corrosive tone that he has set for this country. And we need someone representing us in this district who's willing to work across the aisle, to bridge the divide, to put the people of New Hampshire first, but who's also going to be willing to stand up to the President, to leaders in Congress, to others when they're wrong on policy matters or when they go beyond the bounds of what should be acceptable in the public square. And I'm the only one in this race who's willing to do that. I think it's about restoring decency and integrity, making sure that we have civility in our government. I know that from my experience at the state level, and I'll look to restore that in Washington, D.C.
Our next question comes from Kevin Landrigan.
Thank you. Good to see you both. Mr. Edwards, we know there's a lot to say about the immigration system in this country, but we're looking for something specific here. What two things would need to be included in an immigration bill for you to vote in favor of it?
Well, one thing is we have to secure our border. So I would look for information in a bill that would respect the dignity of our immigration system. I understand why people want to come to this country. This is a very generous nation. And it's great to live in a country where so many people want to come to. But we have a process by which we bring people in. So the first thing we need to do is make sure our borders are secure and we can bring people into this country. Also look at the H-1B visas to make sure that we're bringing people that will speak to a need that our country has, but not just an open border system and people violating the law. We have to get back to a place where we respect law in this country. And I think that's the best way to address our immigration system.
And Mr. Pappas, the question to you, what must-haves are there in an immigration reform bill to earn Chris Pappas's support?
Well, we do need to make important investments in border security, including in manpower and technology. We can have comprehensive immigration reform that adheres to the values of this country without playing on people's fears. And I think there are bipartisan consensus in Congress right now for some major pillars of what could become immigration reform, including allowing the dreamers who know no other country than the United States of America, who are brought here as children, to become citizens of this country, including reforming the visa process so that more seasonal and guest workers can come and be a part of our economy here in New Hampshire and across the country. I think we can get immigration reform done in a bipartisan way that keeps this country safe, that sets up a fair and orderly process, and also adheres to the values of this country and understands that immigrants built the United States.
Mr. Pappas, if you had a job opening at your restaurant, and if an admitted undocumented immigrant trying to support a family came to you looking for a job, what would you do? Would you hire that person?
I've actually been put in that situation and have not hired an individual under those circumstances. And I think that we need to make sure we have laws on the books that protect this country, but also allow for individuals to seek asylum here, to apply for citizenship in an orderly process, because our economy and our future depends on having a legal system of immigration in place.
And Mr. Edwards, we saw from the opening you have a long history in law enforcement. If you pulled over a family and found out they're in this country illegally, would you hold them and turn them over to ICE? Absolutely.
And the reason I would do that, once again, this is about leadership. This is about enforcing our laws and standing up for what's right. If you watch the D.C. Democrats, like Nancy Pelosi and the rest, they're not interested in securing our border. They're not. And I think it's so disingenuous for Chris to stand here and say he would stand up for his party when it comes to some of these issues. He has not. He has not done that. Even here in this state, he has not stood up to his party.
Mr. Pappas, you can have 30 seconds.
Well, I'm not sure he answered that question, but I have stood up to my party. I have voted against my governor and members of the legislature from time to time when I'm in public office. And this is a time in the history of our country where we're required to put country first and stand up to forces in Washington, D.C., you know, the corporations and special interests and the parties that have outside power and influence. And I'm doing this. I'm running for office as a way to give back to my home state. And I'm trying to make a difference for the people of New Hampshire. That's ultimately who I'm accountable to.
Our next question comes from Lauren Chuljian.
Switching gears a bit here and starting with you, Mr. Pappas, it's been a decade since the Great Recession, but now the stock market seems to be more volatile, and the Trump administration is moving to roll back regulations that were passed in the years after the stock market plunged. So would you support relaxing these regulations? Why or why not?
Well, we need to be very careful about the regulations that are in place to prevent a catastrophe like we saw back in 2008 and 2009. It was the greatest recession since the Great Depression. And we need to make sure that there are rules and regulations in place that would ensure that we have a stable economic system and ensure that no bank is too big to fail in our country. I think we have to look for ways to support our Main Street businesses and Main Street banks here in New Hampshire. I would look for ways to do that without easing the burden on the bigger players.
Same question to you, Mr. Edwards.
Absolutely. I think the more we can do to free the free market, to let it operate, the better off we are. We're hearing from business folks around the district and throughout the country that want these regulations off their back. They're hidden taxes. And you know, once again, standing up and saying you're for business owners. That's why the U.S. Chamber of Commerce endorsed me, because they understand that I'm fighting for business owners in this state. And I'll fight for business owners in Washington, D.C. to make sure they're not burdened with regulations that actually crush their businesses and prevent them from hiring people and prevent them from expanding. This is the role that Chris doesn't understand. He thinks by adding more regulations that somehow that would be better for our economy, for our employees, and for business leaders. But he has no way of telling you which regulations that will oversee these businesses.
Well, I know this very well because I'm the co-owner and manager of a 101-year-old restaurant business here in Manchester that I own with my dad and my brother-in-law. We have 230 employees. I understand what it takes to meet a payroll, what it's like to work through insurance regulations, and what it means to deal with regulation and taxation. So I'm familiar with what the business climate looks like in New Hampshire. And in my conversations as I've moved around the state, people want an advocate, someone that's familiar with the Main Street business-driven economy that we have here in New Hampshire, someone who understands the workforce challenges that this state faces, which is a top concern for local businesses. That's where my focus will be as your member of Congress.
All right, staying with Main Street versus Wall Street, back to Lauren Chooljian.
Yeah, and sticking with the idea of accountability. I mean, after the 2008 crash, many average Americans were very financially hurt and wanted people to be punished. But yet, instead of going to jail or getting fined, a lot of those people involved at the top, they got payouts, they got golden parachutes. So if this happens again, and let's first start with you, Mr. Edwards, do you think people should go to jail? I mean, how far should this go to hold people accountable?
I absolutely believe in holding people accountable. And that's what I meant before. We restrain government, we hold our citizens accountable. When you break the law, you should be held accountable. I've done that my entire life. As a law enforcement officer, I've stood up and held people accountable when the law has been violated. And I think that's why you see our state's largest law enforcement community, the New Hampshire Police Officers Association, supporting me. That's why you see business owners supporting me, because they know that I'm someone who's going to hold people accountable and not let people get a free pass. That's been the legacy of the person I am.
How specifically, though, in this terms, if we're talking about the banking industry?
These folks should have been prosecuted. But keep in mind, that was the Obama administration that let that happen. That let these people, what came out and said, too big to fail. That was the Obama administration. That's what I mean, the difference between leadership and people who are willing to hold people accountable by allowing these, corporate leaders to escape punishment. And we see more and more of that. Finally, we're seeing an administration that wants to hold people accountable. Finally, we're going to send new faces, new perspectives to Washington to make sure people are held accountable.
And Mr. Pappas, to you now.
I think we absolutely need accountability with respect to our laws and to ensure that they have teeth so that the American public isn't punished for the bad decisions that our big banks are making. Look, there are a lot of folks in New Hampshire that are living on the margins today. Half the population lives within a $400 emergency of not having anything in their checking account. This is a critical situation that we've got to face to have an economy that works for everyone. So many families have not yet caught up and recovered from the last dislocation that we had in this country in 08 and 09. I think those at the top should be paying a price, and those on Main Street, those working class and middle class families in New Hampshire should be able to move forward in a way that has an economy that is going to work for them.
And so specifically, though, what should that price be?
Well, I think that there's got to be accountability in the justice system, and we've got to lean on our Department of Justice to make those assessments and to go after those bad actors.
Okay, next question comes from John DeStaso.
Thank you. And this, staying with the economy, to Mr. Pappas, President Trump recently praised his trade agreement with Mexico and Canada as historic and said it would not have been possible without steep tariffs on products from those countries, such as aluminum and steel. Now, Mexico says there will be no deal until Trump's tariffs ends. Will you vote for the new NAFTA if you're in Congress, and why or why not?
Well, I think the announcement of a new deal is a good sign for the state of New Hampshire. We're a state with 160,000 jobs that are tied to international trade, mostly with our neighbor to the north in Canada. We benefit from having a stable system in place and trade deals in place that respect our local businesses, our workers, and our environment. And so I would only support agreements that do that. I think that it is a good sign in terms of the terms of the deal that have been announced. But I think we're always better served by calm, sober talks as opposed to the sort of haphazard system of tariffs that this president has undertaken on goods coming into this country. It's made business more expensive for New Hampshire companies. It's raised prices for consumers. It's allowed the customer base to dry up for certain New Hampshire companies. And so I think we should have trade talks not just with Mexico and with Canada. We should open up trade talks with China as well to make sure that we're protecting our business interests and our economic interests right here.
And for Mr. Edwards, same question. Do you also think the president was on the right track with these tariffs?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. I think this once again goes to leadership. The president stepped into office. He realized that we were suffering and we were getting the raw end of the deal. So what did he do? He stepped up, renegotiated the NAFTA deal, and now that's in America's economic interest. You know, when I traveled to this district, I've spoken to people who were hit by some of these tariff deals. And you know what the the voters and the business owners in this district want, they believe in the president because they understand that this is a strategy. It's not a policy, it's a strategy. And what's happened? He's brought the EU around. He's brought NAFTA around. And you're going to see the same thing happen with China. The fact of the matter is this president has engaged in tariff negotiations and talks with other folks. While Chris, every time you ask him a question, he wants to punt to move away from his talking points and punt the ball to someone else to resolve the issue. Not Congress. Congress has a responsibility to step up and do its job here. If Congress had been doing its job, then the president wouldn't have to work this hard.
Mr. Pappas, you've been invoked. You can have 30 seconds.
Sure. I think we are well served by a more thoughtful process than what we've seen, because that's what's going to protect New Hampshire businesses and New Hampshire companies and not raise prices for consumers right here. I was with a solar company in New Hampshire that saw the price of their panels go up 40% because of the tariffs. And I think it's important to understand the implications that this has right on the ground here. We've got to protect our interests.
Okay, next question coming from Lauren Chuljan.
Starting with Mr. Edwards on the opioid crisis, it continues to devastate our state, but federal help has been flowing into the state as far as grants or other resources. So what specific program do you think is working, and what do you think is not working?
Well, this is, again, a lot of an area I have a great deal of experience in. I was known as I was certified as a DRE, which is a drug recognition expert instructor. So I've trained police officers in 23 different states. Saw this developing right here. We knew that the opiate crisis was coming in law enforcement maybe 10, 12 years ago. And we began to talk about the number of people coming through these evaluations night, we call them, who are on prescription medication. So when I look at New Hampshire, we've been disproportionately impacted. And this is a heavy burden for taxpayers. So I think we have to turn back to the pharmaceutical companies and ask them to pay more into relieving the taxpayers of this burden. When you start to look at some of the pharmaceutical tactics used to promote prescription opiates, I think we have to go back and hold people accountable to that. And our AG's office here has sued some of the companies, and you're seeing prosecutions of some of the other folks who were prescribing opiates. But for me, this goes back to prevention and education. So if we start to educate our doctors, patients, moms and dads, I think we're going to be pretty good here. Cops are going to do what we always do in law enforcement. We're going to arrest the bad guy, but we need more in the area of prevention and recovery and treatment.
And Mr. Pappas, one thing that's working, one thing that's not working with the opioid crisis.
This has to be a sustained focus of ours, not just over months and years, but over decades and a lifetime. Because when someone's in recovery, they're there for a lifetime. Our delegation's done some important work working across the aisle to get results and to leverage some more funding for New Hampshire. We're going to invest that to build out a hub and spoke model that's going to allow for more access points around the state of New Hampshire, increase the availability of treatment and recovery opportunities for individuals. That's critically important. One thing we're not doing a good enough job doing right now is measuring outcomes. And so I believe with this additional funding, we'll be able to better assess where the dollars are best spent, where they're most making a difference. It's also important that people have health care. And the best tool we have to fight the opioid crisis is Medicaid expansion. I was proud to provide the pivotal support to implement that program, which now covers 53,000 individuals in our state. Unfortunately, my opponent would have voted against it back in 2014 when Republicans and Democrats came together to craft that solution. So that's just one thing that is working for the people of New Hampshire. We need to continue to insist on more resources to invest in strategies that hold the promise of allowing us to turn the corner on this.
Mr. Edwards, you've been invoked. You can respond.
Sure. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that the taxpayers can't catch a break with Chris. They can't. That entire rant description did not talk about the irresponsibility of the pharmaceutical companies that created this problem and holding them accountable. Then he turns to more government, where he wants a socialized medicine program, a Medicare for all program, that's going to cost this country trillions of dollars. It's going to bankrupt this country. And he won't be honest about this. And he won't tell you how he's going to pay for it. He just wants more government. He can't imagine a system where the free market is involved and we actually hold people accountable without government being involved.
Mr. Pappas, you can respond.
Well, I don't support that, but something I have supported at the state level was giving our Attorney General the ability to go after the drug manufacturers for mismarketing, and they have, and they've been successful at it, and we've invested some more money in prevention because of it. So I think that's what we have to do at the state and federal level, hold people accountable, make sure that we can win some settlements to invest them into prevention and recovery and treatment. I would look for ways to do that at the federal level.
One quick follow-up here. Mr. Edwards, do you believe that opioid addiction is strictly a disease, or do willpower and morals play any kind of role?
Well, I think it's very clear from the people I've interacted with who are become addicted to this. This is something that people become addicted to. I don't think you just have willpower to overcome a medical, chemical, and change system within your human structure. So I definitely believe that this is something that should be addressed and taken very seriously. I don't think this is a moral issue. I think the way we have engaged in this process and gotten here, though, has to do with that. Has to do with a lack of accountability.
Mr. Pappas, if it is a disease and addicts aren't responsible for their behavior towards drugs, how can they be held responsible for crimes?
Well, substance use disorder is a medical disorder, and we have to work to destigmatize it so that individuals can get the care that they need. Individuals have to want to receive the treatment, and that's certainly a part of the challenge that we're facing right now. We have to make sure that they're there at the right time and have access to treatment and services. That's part of the challenge in addressing the opioid crisis head on.
Okay, love it or hate it, here comes the lightning round. Or you can laugh at it, too. And we'll start with Mr. Pappas. If you were going to nominate your opponent for a position in the federal government, what would it be?
Secretary of Veterans Affairs.
All right, Mr. Edwards, how about Mr. Pappas?
That's a great question. Let me see.
I'll give you a good assignment.
Thank you. I'm trying, Chris. I'm really trying. Let me see. Man.
I could represent you in Congress.
No. We can't do that. Let me let's see here. I think you would be good on community affairs. We'll put you in a community affairs position.
Okay, Mr. Edwards, is there a person currently in the U.S. House of Representatives you consider to be a role model?
Interesting. When I look at role models, I look at people who inspired me. So I don't necessarily look to elected officials for role models.
So no one in Congress. Mr. Pappas, how about you? Any role models in Congress right now?
You know, our current representative is the same person today as she winds up her career than when she went down in 2006. And I think that's an admirable quality, the authenticity that she brings to the position.
Okay, Mr. Pappas, have you ever binge-watched a television show?
Yes.
What was it?
Many. You name it. You know, I'm into this show lately called Nailed It, which is these amateur bakers that, you know, make these disaster sort of recipes, and it never turns out right, and it's just sort of funny.
Mr. Edwards, how about you? Have you ever binge-watched television?
Yes. Sons of Anarchy.
All right, motorcycles, of course. Okay, Mr. Edwards, what was the first concert you ever attended?
Oh, Prince.
Wow, that's a good one. Mr. Pappas?
Yes.
It was actually an NSYNC concert at Foxborough Stadium, believe it or not.
Prince and NSYNC, that's two very popular choices there. Okay, here's a little bit more of substance here. New Hampshire allows citizens who can legally own guns to openly carry them in many places. Given today's climate, Mr. Pappas, is there anywhere you think it is inappropriate for a person to openly carry a firearm?
I think we should have gun-free school zones in New Hampshire.
Mr. Edwards, are there any inappropriate places to open carry?
I think that we should hold people accountable if they do something offensive or use their firearm inappropriately.
Okay, we're moving to a next question, and the first district includes a lot of veterans, and it is, of course, home to the Manchester VA facility. We recently spent some time with veterans here in New Hampshire to find out what their priorities are. Here's what Army veteran and Gulf War veteran Mark Sacco had to say.
I believe we need more resources in the VA system, more funding for the veterans, to whether it's physically, mentally, or social programs out there in the general public. I don't want to see politics in the VA system. It doesn't belong there, and it should be more medically managed and by the professionals, not politicians.
We thank Mr. Sacco for his service, of course. But Mr. Pappas, do you think the VA system is adequately funded? And what, if any, are your concerns about politics getting in the way of veterans' care?
Well, I think we need to continue to make sure we deliver on the promise to our veterans. They stood up for us, and we should always be standing up for them. And we've seen a report come out very recently about the Manchester VA and the deficiencies there. There's a pretty clear roadmap of how we can rebuild some confidence, involve veteran service organizations, and make sure that we have a game plan about how we can build up care there. I think we need to continue to insist on funding for a full-service VA in New Hampshire, but in the absence of it, we need to build out the community-based system to allow veterans not to have to travel long distances and to receive care in their own communities. I look at this as one area where we need and really need bipartisan cooperation and action to make sure that we can address the needs not just of vets in New Hampshire but all across this country. And I think that's one place where we can make sure we can come together and do the right thing for our New Hampshire veterans.
Mr. Edwards, how do you respond to Mr. Sacco's concerns?
Well, you know, being a veteran myself, I understand, and I've worked with veterans consistently throughout our state, raising money, connecting with veterans, showing up for veterans. And I think it's, for veterans, when I speak to veterans across this state and across this district, at town halls, I've held a couple of forums for veterans. When I speak to veterans, what they're disappointed in is that they hear, "Thank you for your service," and nothing seems to work out right for them. I think it's time that we really start taking care of our veterans, like we said. Every 65 minutes, a veteran takes his or her life in this country. That's shameful. The fact of the matter is that they've given so much to our nation. And the fact that this less than 1% of our population is serving to protect not only America, but 94% of the globe. We have to do better by our veterans. And that's why I think you're seeing veterans all over the country now stepping forward and running, because they understand leadership. They've been trained in leadership, and they know how to deliver.
Next question comes from Kevin Landrigan.
Mr. Edwards, a recent report from the Department of Defense warns about climate change, and studies that show rising sea levels are putting more than 1,000 homes and the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard at risk. What immediate steps should be taken to protect these properties, and should the federal government cover residential losses, since the government is the entity that needed to take preventive action?
Well, I think when it comes to global warming, what we're hearing from professionals. I think you saw some leadership on the Seacoast recently. They had a conference on global warming. So I think the conversation is taking place. I think the federal government should look and make sure that homes are protected when this is happening. I think we should have the full conversation in terms of making sure that we address these critical needs, particularly not only in New Hampshire, but throughout the country. I think New Hampshire, I think the federal government has a responsibility, but I also think we can't be the only ones carrying that burden. When you look to China, for instance, has nearly double our carbon footprint. And they were given until 2030 to come into compliance, not pay for anything. America stood up and put $1 billion to address these issues. And so when President Trump moved forward to really have this issue renegotiated, once again he was criticized for asking China, one of the biggest violators of this issue, to pay, and he was criticized for that.
And Mr. Pappas, what are your thoughts with regard to the federal government's role here? Should they give assurances to residents that if their homes are severely damaged, the U.S. government will step in and reimburse them?
We can't bury our heads in the sand on this. We are seeing the leading edge of climate change and its impacts on New Hampshire in terms of the severity of storms, sea level rise, the impact on the moose population. So it's very critical that we address this head on. We've seen a commission at the state level that's dug into this in a bipartisan way and produced some recommendations. But this is a national security threat to our country. And so we need to make sure that the federal government is paying attention to this. I also think we have to be responsible about the way that we're handling this and making sure that we're putting the incentives in the right place so that we can wean ourselves off of fossil fuels and make sure that we make investments in renewables that not only hold the promise for environmental policy, but also for our economic future too. We have 1,400 jobs in solar in New Hampshire right now, and that's very exciting. My opponent denies the science behind climate change. I trust it, and I know that we can't not do anything. We've got to leave this world better than we found it.
Mr. Edwards, you've been invoked. You can have 30 seconds.
Sure. I've made this very clear. I don't want America being taken advantage of. Too often, America gets the short end of the stick. So when you step forward and you say to countries like China, step up and pay your costs, step up and engage. And when China is trying to build its economy by increasing its GDP, doubling that over that 15-year period, and America has to pick up that cost, Chris is not interested in supporting America first. He wants to make sure that everyone else is taken care of but America.
We can stay with the environment and stay with Kevin Landrigan.
Can I respond to that?
You can have time within the next question.
Sure.
Are we
going to go to John DeStaso?
No.
It's Kevin? Okay.
Yeah,
Kevin
sure.
on the environment.
Yeah, thank you very much. The dangers of chemicals called PFAS, they're used in plastics and coatings. Mr. Pappas, it's become a new environmental threat. And contaminating drinking water for homeowners in different areas in the 1st District. Our current congressional delegation has financed research into this problem. But what should the next step be?
We need to continue the health studies because families have waited too long to get the information that they deserve about the dangers of these substances and the long-term implications on public health. This is an issue that we see around the Coakley landfill. We also see it in the town of Merrimack, where the St. Gobain Plastics Company has polluted the groundwater of hundreds of homes in the area. So we need to make sure that those people that are still waiting to get hooked up to a public water supply and are on bottled water get the answers that they deserve. And I think we do need to do additional public health studies to look into this emerging contaminant so that we can set the right threshold to keep people safe. There's no more important promise than our government can make than to make sure that we have clean air to breathe and clean water to drink. Unfortunately, under this administration, they've turned over the EPA to the big polluters, to a coal lobbyist who's now in charge, who's loosened regulations around Midwest coal-burning power plants. They've loosened regulations around mercury emissions. That's really dangerous to people here in New Hampshire. The bottom line is we should protect public health and public safety, and we need to do something about the danger that PFCs pose.
And Mr. Edwards, if you're the 1st District Congressman, what would you do to make this a priority?
Well, clearly, what we should be able to guarantee as government is that when a parent turns on that faucet, that water coming out is clean and safe for their family. Also their furry family members as well. We're going to make sure that water is safe. And we can do that by making sure that we have the right information, timely information. You see, I think the CDC has said now that the level should be at 7 to 10. The prior study said 70 was good enough. There's people who've called on the EPA to set a national standard for everyone. That's troubling because New Hampshire has to have the flexibility to address our local concerns. And we should be able to do those, address our local concerns without the feds setting a national standard. The federal government should be there, perhaps in this issue, to provide timely, accurate information and research. Addressing this issue, we should have the resources to address this issue, to guarantee parents and citizens that they will have clean drinking water.
Next question comes from John DeStaso.
Thank you, Adam. Another divisive issue between you, the both of you has been the abortion issue. And Mr. Edwards, you've taken a strong stand against abortion. In a New Hampshire Right to Life questionnaire, you had checked off that you opposed allowing abortion even in cases of rape or incest. You've said that Congress would never vote directly on this. But what's the message that you're trying to convey with this position and as it regards the federal government involvement?
For me, I learned about life from my grandmother, my mother, the appreciation of that. I'm a pro-life candidate. I welcomed 2 lives into this world, held them in my hand, my daughters, and that's informed my decision. My grandmother, my mother, and my daughters, my wife, about life. I respect life. I appreciate life. I'm a pro-life candidate.
Okay. Mr. Pappas, the so-called abortion pill ends a pregnancy up to 10 weeks. The governor of California recently vetoed a bill that would have required the state university system to stock that pill on campus for students. Do you think UNH should carry this pill, and should public money be used for it?
I think it's important that individuals and women have access to the full range of reproductive health care choices. That's why I've been a strong supporter of Planned Parenthood and have supported our state's family planning program, which provides individuals with contraception and basic care and annual exams, so that it has historically over time lowered our abortion rate. I think we can work together in a way that makes sure that people have access to affordable health care in the state at Planned Parenthood and other providers, and I'll support that in Congress. Unfortunately, this is a difference between myself and my opponent. He believes in defunding Planned Parenthood. He also would criminalize abortion even in the cases of rape and incest. I don't think that's the right move for the women of New Hampshire, and I would look to support their rights, make sure that their constitutionally protected right is still in place, regardless of what's happening on the Supreme Court, and I would oppose any legislation that would chip away at it.
Mr. Edwards, you've been invoked. 30 seconds.
You know, I'm really disappointed in Chris because he's began lying about me a few weeks ago, and he's continued this pattern of behavior. The fact of the matter is that here's a place where we should be able to find common ground. I'm a pro-life candidate. He's a pro-choice candidate. He believes in late-term abortions. He believes in government-funded abortions. I disagree with him. Isn't it possible that we get to a place where we have fewer abortions and fewer unwanted pregnancies? Isn't that what we're talking about? But he wants to use this as somehow an attack on women. I represent, there are many women in this country who feel the way I do about life. about protecting life. And so at the end of the day, this is about trying to find common ground.
Mr. Pappas, 30 seconds.
Well, I was highlighting a position that you took in a survey that you answered. And I think it's important that we're honest with the voters of New Hampshire about what our position is, especially on a crucial issue like this. I would protect a woman's right to choose, and I would make sure that individuals have access to the full range of reproductive health care choices.
Getting back to the question, Mr. Pappas, do you think publicly funded abortion pills should be made available at UNH?
I don't think they need to be provided at UNH.
Okay, next question comes from Lauren Chuljan.
Mr. Edwards, I want to take us back to the NHPR debate between the four of us at that time. During a conversation about Social Security, you said you wanted to start weaning people off Social Security, but since you've said your words were misinterpreted, so tell us, what did you mean in that moment?
At that moment, and you were there, and thank you for the question, I began talking about securing Social Security for seniors who are receiving it, folks who are nearing retirement age, and folks who are paying into the system. I used a word that a non-politician would probably use. I don't focus on talking points. I focus on just having a conversation. So I use a word probably that a non-politician would not use. And so when I was asked to clarify that, I said folks who have not begun to pay into retirement at all. And what I wanted to do was put those people into a system where they paid into Social Security, but it was an account for them in Social Security to shore up that Social Security program for future generations and current generations. And so we're having a conversation, and every year, every political cycle, we start to have this conversation, and to put something on the table to discuss it, you can't do in this political climate. Because moments after leaving there, Chris sent out a fundraising email that actually said that I said I wanted to wean seniors off Social Security. Never said that at all. Never said that.
Mr. Pappas, 30 seconds.
It's important that we protect this foundational program, and that's why I've taken the position that I have, that we need to strengthen Social Security, make sure that it's there for today's retirees, as well as people in the workforce today, and those who are just entering the workforce, the same people that Mr. Edwards wants to, quote, wean people off Social Security. I think that's a dangerous position for folks in New Hampshire. We need to make sure that it's there for individuals that when they retire so that they can have a dignified and secure retirement, that they can live with independence. We can work in a bipartisan fashion to fix the program, but not fundamentally change it.
Mr. Edwards, you were invoked 15 seconds there.
Sure. Chris understands what I meant, and he keeps repeating the same mistruth. At the end of the day, we have to have an honest conversation about this. He's not interested in having a conversation. He's interested in sticking to his talking points. I am trying to figure out a way that we address problems in this country, real leadership, not political talking points.
Okay, another question now from Lauren Chuljan on police tactics.
Moving on to another subject. Mr. Pappas, starting with you, the pervasiveness of smartphones and video recordings of interactions between police and citizens has kept a lot of scrutiny on policing tactics, especially in minority communities. So I'm wondering, is there a role, do you think, for Congress that they can play here to provide resources to local police departments, whether it's training or what have you? Do you think there's a role there?
There is a role, and the federal government plays it now, and the resources that they provide for law enforcement are absolutely critical at making sure that our New Hampshire law enforcement has the resources they need to be able to do their jobs. We have a great model in New Hampshire. I support our law enforcement here, and to the extent that I can advocate for federal grants that can be invested in New Hampshire, I'll do that.
And Mr. Edwards, you have said the federal government should absolutely not, in quotes, be involved in reforming local police departments. So who do you think should hold police departments accountable then, if not the federal government?
They're local citizens. Who holds them accountable right now. The New Hampshire Police Standards and Training Council holds our police officers accountable in this state. And every single day, police officers are held accountable. You may not see that as citizens, but I can tell you, as someone who's led in law enforcement, someone who's trained other law enforcement officers in this state, police officers are very proud people, and they do a tremendous job. But they are held accountable when they do things wrong. The fundamental issue that we have in law enforcement is a lack of resources for training. These are men and women from your community who want to do a good job, and they are held accountable. So this notion that they're not held accountable is not factually true. Now, there may be some incidences where you see that, well, what happened in that situation? But by and large, police officers are held accountable every single day. And I think we need resources to make sure they're properly trained consistently. That's much more of the issue.
Next question coming from Kevin Landrigan.
Mr. Pappas, if you win election, you'll be the first openly gay congressman from New Hampshire. Can you describe a time when you have faced homophobia here in this state?
Well, New Hampshire is a welcoming place. It is a live and let live state. It's a wonderful place to call home, and I think the hallmark of our state is that we respect the dignity of each and every person within our borders. And we've been on the leading edge of the fight for equality as well. You know, we do all see it in our own daily lives, and it's much less present than it ever used to be. But I think it's important that we look for ways to make sure that everyone is respected under the law and that everyone is included in the economic and social life of this country. That's why passing the Equality Act at the federal level to make sure that individuals can't be discriminated against based on who they are or who they love in employment, in their housing, in public accommodations is a priority of mine.
And Mr. Edwards, your election would also be a historic one, as you would be the first black congressman elected in New Hampshire. Can you describe a time when you've faced racism here in the Granite State?
I can. I actually, unfortunately, this is not reflective of New Hampshire. It's reflective of some leaders in New Hampshire who held positions, and these were not conservatives. And that's one of the things that I think is such a distortion, that somehow blacks are automatically supposed to be aligned with Democrats and Democrats are fighting for minorities. The discrimination I faced in this state and what I responded to was actually done by Democrats, questioning my intelligence, questioning how I got my job, things like that. And I think I was kind of shocked because these are the folks who said, oh yeah, we fight for minorities, and they didn't. So I've faced that, I've stood up to that. And unfortunately, Chris has not stood up to his own party. Again, the Democratic Party brought Alex Baldwin to our state, someone who has used racist slurs, someone who's used anti-gay slurs, and he didn't do anything about that. He didn't challenge his party on that.
Mr. Pappas, 30 seconds.
I'll stand up to anyone who has racist, anti-Semitic, homophobic, misogynistic views. I'll do it for anyone who holds a public office or anyone who is in public life or who's an actor. And I think it's well beyond the bounds of what's acceptable behavior for people today. So I'll call it out. I'd like my opponent to call out statements from members of his own party, including the President of the United States. When they've been made in the past, I don't think he's done that.
That flows into our next question, so let's have John ask that.
Yes, as soon as this election's over, we're right into 2020 and the presidential primary. So, Mr. Edwards, you're a strong supporter of President Trump in the upcoming, as of now. Would you be open to a challenge to him, or are you committed that there should be no challenge to the president?
The President of the United States is our president. It was a fair election. He won the election. I think people should embrace and support the president, because if he's successful in defending and representing our country, we're all a little bit better off for that. The notion that we can keep this resistance movement up in this country and keep attacking our fellow citizens, I think it's misguided. So I don't think people are free to do whatever they want to. But I would not support a Republican primary against our president. Not at all.
Mr. Pappas, why do you think that this president's approval ratings have gone up recently, which they have? Are Democrats kind of missing the point and continuing to misunderstand why there is a very large segment of the population that does support President Trump?
I meet voters each and every day, and most voters in New Hampshire are independents who make their decisions based on issues and individuals, not based on party. And we've seen this seat swing back and forth many times in the recent past and voted for Donald Trump by a very narrow margin. I think people are looking for action. They're looking for results. They're looking for people to be collaborative and to work together on solutions. That's how I've won in a district that also voted for Donald Trump and lots of other Republicans. And I'm working to build a broad-based coalition of Republicans, Independents, and Democrats who support my candidacy, who know I'll always put the people of New Hampshire first. I think that's how we're going to make a difference.
Okay, we're getting close to closing statement time, but we've got a little wiggle room so we can have another lightning-esque question. We've got a WMUR Monday Night Football game coming up in just a little bit, so I'm assuming we're all Patriots fans here. Mr. Pappas, to you first. The Patriots' fantastic success, is it the result of Bill Belichick's coaching or Tom Brady's quarterbacking? Who's responsible?
Well, it's a great combination, but you got to give the credit to Brady.
Okay, and Mr. Edwards?
Well, the athletes are on the field, and someone who's played football, I'd go with the athlete.
All right, Tom Brady it is. Okay, we are now going to move to closing statements, and we begin with Mr. Pappas.
Well, thank you, Adam. Thank you to the panel. Thank you to Eddie Edwards for being with us tonight, and to everyone who tuned in. I have to say, we need checks and balances in Washington, D.C. And as someone who's run a local business, who served on the Executive Council for 6 years, I know what it takes to listen and to put the people of New Hampshire first. We need to work together on solutions for the people of this state, to bring down the cost of college, to invest in job training and skills training programs, to make sure that we make health care more affordable and ensure that we don't discriminate against people with pre-existing conditions, to protect our natural environment, and to end the outsized influence that big corporations and special interests have in the halls of Congress. We've got to make Washington work for us. You know, this race is really personal for me. It's about a state I grew up in. It's about the people that I know that I'm meeting each and every day out on the campaign trail. They deserve an advocate who's going to work across the aisle to get things done, and who will stand up to individuals in Congress and in the White House who are pushing an agenda that's going to undermine our success. So I look forward to the discussion out on the campaign trail these next few days. I ask for your vote on November 6th. Thanks so much.
Mr. Edwards, a closing statement.
Well, thank you so much for listening tonight, and thank you for your questions, and thank you, Chris, for participating. And Adam, wonderful job as always. So, listen, I came to this state over 30 years ago. 30 years ago. And this state welcomed me in. You know, the values I grew up with my grandmother and coming to New Hampshire and seeing the wonderful spirit of New Hampshire about freedom and liberty and making sure that you had opportunities, but you were held accountable. I think this race is so important to our state that we finally get someone in Washington, D.C. who will stand up for New Hampshire values, that will represent us in a proud way, that will bring us together, that will deliver the spirit that this country so desperately needs to unify our nation. I'm that person. You know, I've raised 2 children in this state, started a business in this state, served in our law enforcement community in this state, served our nation as a sailor. And I've done so proudly. I've given over 30 years of community service back here, but from coaching high school football, chaperoning high school graduations. This is a time that we can all rise up and send someone to Washington, finally, who you can trust and won't lie to you, won't misrepresent you, and bring back home the principles that are consistent with New Hampshire. Thank you so much.
Mr. Edwards, Mr. Pappas, we thank you. That does it for the 1st Congressional District debate. You can join us tomorrow at 7 p.m. for the candidates in the 2nd Congressional District debate. We'll take a break on Halloween, of course, and then we'll hear from the candidates for governor on Thursday. Now, if you missed any part of tonight's debate or wanted to share it with a friend, you can find it in the Commitment 2018 section of WMUR.com and our mobile app. Again, thank you to the candidates here in the 1st Congressional District. Thank you to our wonderful live audience tonight. And thank you to the New Hampshire Institute of Politics. Have a good evening.